Lovely to see you all and lovely to think of Cork. I'm home in Dublin at the moment, but the story I thought I'd like to share with you tonight is a story that I came across while on lockdown recently. For our friends in the States and other places, probably like us, you've had various forms of lockdown, but our lockdown came very, very quickly last March. We hardly got any warning. Suddenly it was lock everything down, cut yourself off, knuckle down. And I found myself in a strange place because my husband was ill and he had just had treatment. And when we heard that, we realized he wouldn't be safe in the city. So we took off, packed the car, and went down to Connemara, where he had a house under a mountain in a very isolated place. So I found myself down there in Connemara under a mountain, and it was as if the 21st century had never happened. In fact, it was as if the 20th century hadn't happened, because there were no cars, no people, no sounds, just the landscape and the roads and the sheep. I got to know the sheep very well, and I was beginning to enjoy the sheep. They ran the show, walking along the road. They hadn't had their lambs yet, and they were like ladies on a catwalk with their painted cloaks as they strutted along the roads. But that's not the story I want to tell you about. My story is, I suppose, a story about a story, because we weren't completely isolated there. We had the internet and we had the phone. And one day, Art, my husband, got an email from a friend of his to say that there was an artist in the area and that she was very interested in an idea based on a poem by a great Irish poet called Moya Cannon. And the idea, the poem was called Carrying the Songs. And Daniel, you'd be interested in this. It was about when people move. Moya says in the poem that those who have little else to carry are the people who carry the songs. And she talks about how songs move all over the world and how they change as they move. And this artist, Nicole and Orla would know her, she got the idea of a story project based on that. And the message was, would Nuala be interested in this? The story that was going to be carried had started on the Aran Islands, had come from a young storyteller who was a grandnephew of a famous Irish story writer and storyteller called Liam O'Flaherty. And the story had begun in Irish and had moved to the Gaeltacht area of Connemara and had been then moved to North Connemara and had been translated into English. And the idea was, it was kind of, in Irish, it's Dúirt ban lum go Nuairt ban lei. A woman told me that a woman told her, are kind of Chinese whispers. And I, of course, emailed back and said, this sounds really interesting, I'd be interested. Anyway, to make a long story short, Alana got in touch with me immediately. And in a few weeks' time, I heard a story. And my job then was to hear the story and pass the story on to the next person. So I'd like to tell you the story that came to me during the lockdown. And it was told to me by a young girl. I can't really remember her name. I think she was about 15. And she said the story came from a small village in Connemara called Roundstone. Fado, a long time ago, in a small fishing village, the custom was that the men would go out fishing and the women would stay at home. Now, the women had the hardest job. because the women at home, they had to look after the children, they had to look after the old people, they had to look after the land, they had to do the cooking, they had to look after the animals, and the men would go off fishing, but they would usually come back with the fish. Now, it happened that the men would come back night after night with hardly any fish at all. And the women were getting a bit fed up about this. There they were, working all the time, keeping everything going, and there was no fish coming home. So there was one particular woman, and she was curious. She had an interest in fishing. She had the interest in the sea, but in those days they didn't really approve of women going to sea. In fact, if you had red hair, I'm sorry, Nicole and Orla, with the beautiful red hair, you wouldn't even be allowed on a boat. But this particular woman had an interest in fishing, and she said she wanted to go out herself and find out what was the problem. Why were the men catching no fish? So reluctantly, they allowed her to come along with them. And lo and behold, that day they went out, they cast out the nets, pulled them in full of fish. So they came home, and this was a great mystery how suddenly they were having the luck that they'd lost. So the other woman became interested, and they said they'd like to go out and see how they'd get on, and they joined in. And soon the women were the ones who were going out fishing, and the men stayed at home. The men realized that the women had a lot of work to do at home, and they decided maybe that they'd go out too and see how it would work if they went. And the women said, no, you can't go because you're cursed. There's a curse on you, and you'll have no luck if you go out. Now, the woman who had the idea in the first place to go out was curious about this. How come the men were cursed? And she was one of those women who couldn't let it go. And she decided she would go out herself and find out what the basis of the curse on the men. What was all that about? So out she went. Now, she had been warned that the weather wasn't good, but she said she'd risk it. She was curious enough, and out she went. And sure enough, the weather started to get a bit rough. But she decided she'd go a little bit further, and she threw out the nets. Well, if she did, a huge wave came towards her, and she realized she was in serious trouble. The wave was enormous, 10 foot high, and it looked as if it was going to fall down on top of her and she'd be drowned. But she thought very quickly. She knew that always on a fishing boat there's a knife. They always have a knife aboard a boat. So she grabbed the knife, lifted it, and she flung it at the wave. With that, it was as if she had sliced the wave in two, because the wave opened and her boat was pulled into a channel. And as if there was a current underneath the boat was pulled northward and further, up northward, into waters that she had never known existed before, way up north. And eventually the sea calmed and her boat was pulled in to a small little inlet. She was delighted that she had survived it. And so she pulled the boat up and she got out and she lay down and she was having a bit of a rest, when all of a sudden she heard a sound. The sound of breathing. When she opened her eyes, there were 4 black heads in the water looking out at her, and brown black eyes staring towards her. Seals, Ronta they were. And one particular big seal pushed himself out of the water and clippity-clop, clippity-clop, went over to her. Will Manasa. Ke wareg Manasa. was talking. And she said, Ke he Anasa, who is Anna? And the voice said, Anna, Shima Van, it's my wife. Who killed my wife? And with that, she realized what the curse was about. She stayed the night there, and next morning she made her way back down south towards the place that she had come from. She pulled the boat ashore and she told the men the reason there was a curse on them was because they had been killing the seals. The women hadn't known they'd been killing the seals, but there was competition between the seals and the fishermen for the fish. And she warned them that if they continued to kill the seals, the curse would continue. And so it was. In that place, they stopped killing the seals. It was considered to be bad luck to kill a seal. Now, I told you the story came from a place called Roundstone, and the Irish for Roundstone is Cloch na Rón, the rock of the seals. And that was the story that was told to me. And that was the story that I was asked to tell to a woman from Mayo. And then that story went to Achill. And then the story went up to Belmullet, which is in the north of Mayo. And the people in Belmullet who heard the story said, that story comes from the 1940s. We haven't heard it since 1947. Now, I want to tell you the story about that story, because that was my story, with just one little part of the story. The story has travelled, has been carried through Alana and through Zoom and through the wonders of the internet. It went from Mayo up to the north of Ireland, over to Scotland, up to Scandinavia, then right down through Europe into Eastern Europe. The story has now been told from last spring until now, has been told 386 times by 29 storytellers in 47 different languages. And you can imagine how that story has changed as it was carried along, o Vale go Bale, from mouth to mouth. And next Saturday at 2:00 Irish time, the final version of the story is going to be told in Istanbul. And we'll hear what happened to the story as it was passed from one person to another. And that's a story I thought I would tell you, the story that came to me. And I think it's an amazing story about storytelling and about stories. Thank you.
Rose.